one of the guys who wants to change the narrative on what it means to be a man, John Seel. Okay.
I was thinking about handshakes. Two most important handshakes I ever had one was with Ronald Reagan. But that paled in comparison to the handshake I had with Princess Di. I was just standing there and she walked right up to me. My son was standing next to me. He said, "Dad, don't embarrass me." Just like, don't embarrass me. And I went around the rest of the day with my hand in the air. I have looked for a long time, and I have come to the place where I know the source of all the problems lie. A room filled with mostly white, straight, American, Protestant males in the 1%. Now that is the narrative of the mainstream media. You are the problem. My aim in writing this book is to flip the script. And of all the books I've written, this book is the most NCS-ish book I've written. Most of the books I write are about culture or business, and they're kind of arm's length. This book is born out of, as I write in the first chapter, this book is born out of blood, bourbon, and brokenness, which make it perfect for NCS. Everyone recognizes that there's been a crisis of masculinity. Men are doing terribly, and men know it, and the culture refuses to acknowledge that it is a problem. So largely, the problem is ignored, or you are defined as the problem by women or by the mainstream press. In other circles, the very notion of whether there is such a thing as masculine is in question. Put it this way, if you can't answer the question, what is a woman? The question of what is a man is much more difficult to answer. Because what is a woman is actually biologically and physically woven into their being. Historically speaking, the idea of masculinity has always been more fragile and therefore has always had a cultural support system around it. In other words, there was always in every culture and every tribe some kind of event that was celebrated with rituals that moved a person from being a boy to a man. And the general psychological rule is that no man is a man unless a man tells them that they are a man. So men need men to affirm their masculinity. And of course, then the problem is that if you go to the church, the church's general rule of thumb is to define men as toxic and filled with problems. And if you look at books, as I did on this problem, every chapter is headed by one of your dysfunctions. We got a chapter on lust. We have a chapter on anger. We have a chapter on shame. We have a chapter on apathy. We have a chapter on loneliness. And it goes on. And I'm like, if you continue to define your identity and who you are, the problem becomes your identity. I'm very much in favor of AA, and I've had lots of close friends who've been friends of Bill, and so I know I'm very supportive. But at some point, it's helpful to actually recognize your identity as larger than your addiction. In other words, at some point, you've got to allow your identity to be rooted heavily in the higher power and not in the problem you're trying to overcome. Now, that's a transition that they make, but it's often people get stuck because that's how they describe themselves all the time. Now, I wanted to flip the script. And I said, let's change the narrative, not in terms of what are our problems, but what is the ideal? What does God have intended for us as men? What is the aspirations? If you're an athlete and you're running track, you mentally envision all the ways you could succeed. You don't envision, I'm tripping over the first hurdle. If you want to get through the race, that is. And so what we need is a new renewal of the positive aspects of men and what it actually can be. And that's the burden of this particular book. Now, it's also aspirational, not because I have figured it all out. It's aspirational because it's a project. It's a work in progress. In fact, I think masculinity is a verb, not a noun. That is, it's a developing dynamic. It's not something you are. And if you frame your understanding of masculinity merely in terms of chromosomes, X, Y, then you become a thing. And actually, masculinity is best understood as a certain kind of relationship. And so this is a book that deals with our core identity. How do we develop an identity, a male identity? How does that identity get framed into our work? And how is that work reinforced in our relationships, in our marriages? That's the essence of the book. Now, I didn't start there. I started because I'm a culture guy and I look at cultural problems, and I realized I don't have very many books left to write because I don't have that much time left. And so I need to think about what really matters. What is upstream? If you're trying to deal with pollution in the Mississippi River, it's a much different project to try to address the problem in New Orleans than in Lake Itasca, Minnesota, which is the headwaters of the Mississippi. In fact, Lake Itasca, the Mississippi exits to the north and then swings around. And where it exits, you can actually walk across the Mississippi with stepping stones. Now, University of Minnesota has a research center there. They know that it's important, and they do study it. But I think that of all the social problems we have in the world, masculinity and men are at the epicenter of the problem. As goes families, so goes society. As goes husbands, so goes marriages. As goes men. I mean, the problem is you are not only the epicenter of the problem, you are the epicenter of the civilizational cure. If we can address this positively and come to terms with who we are in Christ and have a renewed vision of what we can become, you are the tip of the spear of the civilizational crisis that we're living in. And so it's enormously important to come to terms with what that means. And I think of all the subject matters, this one is pretty high up the chain in terms of being important. Now, I will say this, that identity is a topic that we toss around, but we don't really have a sense of being comfortable in our own skin and who am I. And this was a very real struggle for me for many, many years. You can have problems because you had a bad father. You could have problems because you have an absent father. And you can have problems if you have an exceptional father. Fathers play a huge dynamic role in our lives, for good or ill. And one of the things that most people don't realize that America is an outlier in the world. We have 3 times more fatherlessness than any other country in the world. It's actually slightly more than that. The average of the world is 7%. United States is 27%, except in minority communities, it's 50. It's like 4 or 5 times. And then we wonder why. So masculinity is fragile. Fathers play a disproportionate role. There needs to be a transition from being a boy to a man. No person can actually become a fully man unless a man tells them they are. And then we have no men telling people that they are. And then we wonder why we have all these downstream problems, which is acute. I mean, the number one social statistical variable for suicide is being male. Incarceration. I mean, it's just a terrible, all the downstream problems stem from this. Now, my struggle with identity is I'm named for my father, who was larger than life. He was a medical missionary in South Korea. He was a gentle giant. Not typical of missionary doctors. He studied at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and we came home on furlough. He worked at MD Anderson, and he was like the top cancer doc around. His research was written up in Time magazine, and he was a concert violinist, and he was, I mean, a writer, a poet, and he was also AWOL. I mean, he also spent his life at the hospital, and he wouldn't throw a football with me because, first of all, he was uncoordinated, and secondly, his hands belonged to his patients, not to his son. And if he threw a football, chances of him jamming his fingers were actually high. And so we had a little bit of a gap. I played maybe 25 games in high school football. My father came to 2. We lost both. The last one, my senior year, was a championship game. We were behind by 6 points, and on about the 30-yard line, they called a play which had basically a pitch out to the halfback who threw the pass to me on a flag pattern, on a post pattern. And I caught the ball on the 1-yard line, scored a touchdown, the crowd went wild, and tears were streaming down my face. Because I was offsides. And the play was called back. And we lost the game by 6 points. Now, the tears had nothing to do with the game. Nothing. They had to do with my dad. And, you know, I can relive that moment, and it feels very similar, 50 years, 60 years later. Now, by God's grace, my father and I got all sorted out before he died, and life goes on, and I've learned to be comfortable in my own skin and use my entire name. Earlier books, you'll see John Seel. More recent books, you'll see David John Seel Jr. You'll see the whole name, and that's part of my journey, related to my own identity. But the key to our identity is derived only in three ways. The culture tells you you design your own. Well, that's a myth. Some well-meaning Christians think that you can discover it by taking some kind of psychological profile test and do kind of reductionistic this, that, and the other, and then, oh, you're an Enneagram 8 with a wing 2 or something, or, you know, you're this on Myers-Briggs, INTJ, or you're a Gemini, as I am. Well, that tells you something about me, but it doesn't actually, it's reductionistic. In other words, if we in college saw girls walk by and described them as different makes of a vehicle, there's a Porsche, there's a Cadillac, there's a Studebaker. First of all, it's heavily misogynist and reductionistic. It's rude. But if you use those kind of quantitative numbers to define your identity, you're being that rude to yourself. We're much more than that. Which leaves only the third option in terms of our identity. That is, our identity is derived out of a relationship larger than ourselves. It's derived out of a relationship with God Himself. That is, you're born male, but you cannot become fully a man unless you're reborn and are living out of the life of Christ living within you. Now, I hate to be quite so blunt, but the fact is that you cannot get back to Genesis 1 without the cross, because you need to be recreated from within. You need to have resources beyond yourself. The game is not self-improvement. The game is to live out of the dynamic of a supernatural life, living its life in and through you in ways that you could never be and do yourself. So you become fully who you are only when Jesus becomes evident in and through you. So you have to actually come to God in order to find yourself, in order to be fully who you want to be. And that is a dynamic, dependent relationship which is derived. Now, pragmatic male types really are much more interested in give me the 1, 2, 3, 4, and this kind of mystical stuff about union with Christ and life of Christ within sounds very pietistic, very little over spiritual, and I'm not quite sure I know what to do with it. Well, first of all, I have a general assumption that every major spiritual pattern has a comparable pattern in nature. The academic term for that is biomimicry, and I think there is spiritual biomimicry. So the first move of your houseplant is not down and in. The first move of your houseplant is up and out, because it recognizes that its source for life is derived from a source outside of itself, namely the sun. And it must have that sunlight in order to thrive and live. The source of all life on this planet is the sun. And what most people don't quite realize is that that light, which provides the energy for all life, is invisible. You never, ever see light. You see the reflection of light. That's why space is dark, or black. So the fact is, all of reality is dependent on a source other than itself, larger than itself, which is an invisible energy, but that in itself orients us in the right direction, but it doesn't transform us until that light enters us, and through the process of photosynthesis, that light becomes life and fuel within. And if we live out of that resource, well, you just look at the plants. It'll tell you three things. what happens? You get a flower, which turns into a fruit, which holds a seed. And so you get beauty, nourishment, and legacy out of the life lived from within. There are results that are inevitable. Not by straining, not by self-improvement, but the fact of the matter is we need to be transformed. And this is not theory, this is not moral, this is actual. The original title of this book, which men hated, women loved, and so I went with the current title. The original title was Embodied Enchantment. Now, embodied enchantment, which is basically emphasizing the fact that the life of Christ is living within us. The great mystery of all times, which has now been revealed, Paul tells us in Colossians, is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And that is, the God of the universe actually is living physically within me and enabled me to live a life I could never be and do because his life is within me. That is the source of my identity. And that identity has to be renewed every day. I put my hand on my chest and say, God, you are within me. The God of the universe is living within me. My life is an adventure because you're now walking your life out through me, and I am simply becoming a little Christ. The reason Jesus says it's a much better plan for me to go away and than for you to actually have the experience of walking with Jesus in Israel. Much better plan. In other words, we are living in the time of the much better plan. And the reason it's a much better plan is Christ is not alongside us. Christ is in us. Christ can be everywhere through you. And life becomes an adventure of watching Christ live his life in and through you. Now, when you get your identity rooted in Christ, who you are as an expression of that reality gets externalized in terms of your interest, passion, and focus. And that externalization of your identity is framed as your calling. So your work, this is much bigger than your work. Your work needs to be an expression of who you are in Christ as an expression of your calling in Christ. And you need to be a part of something larger than yourself. Now, actually, who gets this? This is not rocket science. Of the 5 service academies, which service academy understands the need for a unique sense of identity and makes it a simple premise of who they are? Marines. Semper Fi. Absolutely. Once a Marine, always a Marine. In 6 weeks, they turn a boy into somebody who is committed to something larger than themselves. It's that same process that is what we need to be in Christ. On my flight up here, I sat next to a very large man with a military haircut, and turned out he was a special ops Marine. 4 tours, medically discharged for TBI because his Humvee was blown up in Fallujah, and he was the only one who survived. And he was in the gun turret, and he wasn't strapped in, so he got thrown from the vehicle. Everybody else in the vehicle was killed, and he was thrown. That's why he lived. But we talked about masculinity. In 10 seconds, we were on to spiritual things because he understood the dynamic of being somebody committed to something larger than yourself. Now, our callings, or military parlance, MOS, our specialties need to be understood, defined, and framed. There's a book out, I won't mention the name of the author, that basically says every part of your life is a calling. You're called as a husband, you're called as a worker, you're called as a church member. I mean, so every part of your life is a calling. If every part of your life is a calling, then your life has no definitive calling. Now, I mean, it frames the Lordship of Christ over the whole of your life, I get it. But the fact is, you need to be about something. There needs to be some domain in the world in which you're saying, okay, I'm passionate about this. I'm going to commit myself to this. This is my domain. This is my MOS. This is my terrain. I'm not, if I'm the mechanic in a marine company, I'm going to be really good at this aspect of fixing the vehicles. But if everything is the same, then you don't have definition in your life, and your life needs to be defined by something particular. My calling has to do with helping the church understand how to be, what is happening in culture in order to be more effective in culture. That's what I do. That's really who I am. And every book I write, every project I get involved with, I try to decide, is that fit who I am and what my responsibilities are? Now, the final thing, of course, is our relationships. And they can be friends and or spouses. And they should be a catalyst in your calling. If you really want to understand who a person is, all you have to do is look at their 5 best friends. They'll tell you everything. Because it's always peer preference before it's peer pressure. Do your 5 friends help you level up to be greater than yourself in the area of your calling? And your wife. People get married for a whole range of reasons. The culture tells you get married because of consent. 2 adults. Marriage is whatever 2 adults decide it's going to be, which is, it's got about a 40% failure rate. Christians say, oh, no, there's something much better than that, and that is what we need is to find your soulmate and really find chemistry and have a soulmate marriage, which is so special and so precious and celebrated on Hallmark movies. And all those Hollywood actresses or Christians are all doing either Lifetime or Hallmark movies. Well, that approach has 2 times the higher divorce rate than the other one. That's obviously not helpful. And what we need is to actually have marriage be understood as a shared commitment to something larger than ourselves. That is, we are in a shared calling, a calling-centric marriage. Now, you know where you see those? You see them in military families where they're not getting divorced, like Navy too in particular, or submariner in particular. The royal family was always about being married to something larger than yourself, namely being a royal. Until recently, it was redefined. The younger generation didn't have that sense of marriage being about something larger, not a shared sense of calling. But if you want a solid marriage, what you need is to have a shared sense of calling, which is what you would see if you're a missionary. Missionary couples have to basically be committed to being missionaries together. And so they're into the project together. And so you have to define how you bring your family into a larger sense of meaning. Now here's the nub. If in fact our identity is rooted in Christ and living out of the resources that He provides, and our work is an externalization of our identity which is rooted in Christ, and our marriage is reinforcing our calling because it's shared together, and our marriage is symbolic of our union to Christ. All of a sudden, we've come full circle, and we're capable of living a seamless life. You are not the tip of the problem. You are the tip of the solution. We need confidence to be outspoken men who are living out of the life of Christ with confidence and with the adventure that entails. This is our moment. And if ever a civilization needs men to step up and be men, this is now. This is our time. And of all the groups I can think of, probably none is more important than NCS. Thank you very much.